Chapter 1: A Storm of Secrets. The storm raged outside, its winds howling through the streets as if the heavens themselves were protesting what was about to unfold inside the walls of Holy Ground Ministries. Inside the massive hall, the air was thick with anticipation, the congregation packed tightly in their seats, waiting for the arrival of Prophetess Patricia, known to her followers as Mama Essie. Whispers floated through the crowd, each person murmuring in hushed tones, their eyes wide with reverence and hope. "She's coming. I can feel it," a voice whispered in the row ahead. "She will heal me today. I just know it," another murmured, clutching a crumpled note with a prayer request. At the front of the church, the stage was bathed in soft golden light. The altar, adorned with candles, incense, and offerings, was set for the arrival of the prophetess. The energy in the room was electric, the kind of energy that could only come from the desperate hearts of people who had nowhere else to turn. "She can see into our souls," an elderly woman sitting next to Elizabeth muttered, her voice trembling with awe. "Mama Essie knows everything. No secret is safe." Elizabeth, sitting in the back of the hall, stared at the altar with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. She had attended this church for months, feeling the weight of the congregation's fate pressing in on her. But there was something in the air today that unsettled her, an undercurrent of tension that seemed to ripple through the room, unseen but undeniable. She shifted in her seat, trying to push the unease aside. "Maybe it's just the storm," she thought, but the feeling remained. Then, the doors at the back of the hall opened with a slow, deliberate creak, and the crowd fell silent. The whispering stopped. Every eye turned toward the entrance. Mama Essie stepped into the room, her presence commanding and magnetic. She wore a flowing white robe that shimmered under the lights, her face serene and flawless, as if untouched by time. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back in loose waves, and her eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the room as she moved with grace toward the altar. The crowd erupted in applause, standing and clapping in unison. Some cried out in joy, others in desperation, as they witnessed the arrival of their Savior, the woman who had promised miracles, healing, and deliverance. Elizabeth remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching, waiting for something, anything, that would explain the strange feeling gnawing at her gut. As Patricia ascended the steps to the altar, she paused, looking over the congregation. Her smile was warm, radiant even, as she raised one hand to calm the crowd. The noise slowly died down, leaving only the sound of the storm raging outside. "My beloved children," Mama Essie's voice rang out, smooth and soothing, like a melody. "Today, you will see the power of God in ways you have never imagined. Your faith will be rewarded. Today, we will break every chain, heal every wound, and deliver every soul in need of grace." The crowd responded with an uproar of praise, clapping and shouting. But Elizabeth remained quiet, watching with a steady gaze. She had heard Patricia's speeches before. She had seen the miracles, healing the sick, blessing the barren, giving the blind their sight, but something in her gut told her that today would be different. A scream cut through the air, sharp and jarring, drawing everyone's attention to the side of the hall. Agatha, one of Mama Essie's trusted aides, rushed toward the front, her face wide with shock and fear. She was holding the hand of a man in a wheelchair, his body stiff, his face pale. "Mama!" Agatha cried out, her voice trembling. "It's him. It's the crippled man." The crowd gasped, murmurs of disbelief spreading through the hall. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "This again?" she thought, her heart sinking. She had seen this man just days ago, walking around the market, healthy and whole. The confusion in her heart began to grow, but she said nothing. Mama Essie moved swiftly to the man's side, her hands lifting toward him in a gesture of divine authority. "In the name of the Almighty, I heal you," she declared, her voice powerful, commanding. Elizabeth watched as Mama Essie laid her hands on the man's forehead, her fingers glowing faintly with an ethereal light. The congregation held their breath, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The man in the wheelchair gasped, his body twitching, his eyes fluttering open. And then, to the collective of the crowd, he stood slowly, shakily, before collapsing into the arms of Agatha, who was now crying tears of joy. The room exploded in applause. People jumped to their feet, some shouting, others crying. The man, once crippled, was now walking, no, running, around the altar, free from the chains that had bound him. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. She couldn't deny that it was impressive. The man, whose legs had been useless only moments ago, was now walking as if he had never been sick. But something about it felt off. She had seen him just days ago, walking through the market. She had seen the truth. This wasn't a miracle, this was deception. As the crowd cheered, Elizabeth stood up and made her way out of the hall, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She had to get out of there. The lies were too thick in the air, and she could no longer breathe them in without feeling sick. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the storm inside her mind was just beginning. She knew something was wrong. The healing, the miracles, the divine revelations, all of it felt like smoke and mirrors. But who would believe her? Patricia had the power, the influence, the following. Elizabeth had nothing. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, seeing a message from her friend, Clara. "Did you see? Another miracle today. Mama Essie healed a crippled man. This is amazing. Everyone's talking about it." "Yeah," Elizabeth typed back, "amazing." But as she hit send, she felt a weight settle in her chest. This wasn't just a crisis of faith. It was something darker. Patricia wasn't just deceiving people, she was controlling them. And if Elizabeth didn't stop her, she might just become another one of Mama Essie's victims. The night was quiet now, but Elizabeth knew this was just the calm before the storm. Her doubts had already set her on a path she couldn't ignore. There was more to Mama Essie than anyone realized. And Elizabeth was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. Chapter 2: The Rise of Mama Essie. Elizabeth's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway as she made her way through the church, the sound of the congregation's cheers still ringing in her ears. The man who had been miraculously healed now ran across the altar, his once useless legs carrying him with ease. The crowd had erupted in adoration, but Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that crawled beneath her skin. Something was wrong, something she couldn't yet put into words. She stepped outside into the cool night air, the sky heavy with clouds, the wind carrying the lingering weight of the storm. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from Clara. "Everyone is talking about the healing. You should come back in. It's unbelievable." Unbelievable, Elizabeth thought bitterly. She wasn't sure what was more unbelievable, the man's sudden recovery or the fact that no one seemed to notice the deception. No one, except her. But how could she prove it? Who would believe her? Patricia's influence stretched so far beyond the walls of the church, her reach extended into every corner of the city, if not the nation. Patricia was a symbol of hope for so many. A prophetess with the divine power to heal, to see into the hearts of the faithful. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth as Elizabeth made her way toward her car, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and curiosity. What was Patricia's secret? How could a woman who had been so humble, so devout, suddenly wield so much power? She had heard the stories, whispers of her rise to prominence, the miracles that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But what about the rumors? The rumors that Mama Essie wasn't just a prophetess, but something darker, something unearthly. Elizabeth couldn't ignore them. She'd seen the way Patricia moved, the way she carried herself. There was something too perfect about it, too polished. No one should be that flawless, that poised, that divinely gifted. Her car door clicked open, and she slid inside, the familiar scent of leather and old paper grounding her for a moment. The engine hummed to life as she drove, the streetlights casting long shadows on the wet pavement. The night was quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. But even the stillness felt unsettling. As she reached her apartment, Elizabeth sat in the car for a moment, staring at the reflection of the rain-slicked streets in the windshield. She had to know more. She had to find the truth. The next day, she returned to the church, determined to gather more information. Patricia's performance was nothing short of spectacular, but Elizabeth knew that something wasn't right. She sat in the back row this time, watching carefully as the service unfolded, keeping her eyes peeled for any signs of deception. During a break in the service, Elizabeth overheard two elderly women talking in hushed tones. "She's the one. Mama Essie is the real deal," one woman said with awe. "I came here broken, desperate for a miracle. And she healed me. I'm a witness to the power of God." I know, the other woman replied. "She's been touching lives all over the city. They say her powers go beyond just healing the sick. She knows things she couldn't possibly know. It's like she sees right through you." Elizabeth's ears perked up. She knows things. It was true that Patricia's reputation had grown over the years. But the more people spoke of her gifts, the more Elizabeth began to question whether they were truly gifts or something darker, something more manipulative. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth decided to take a different approach. Instead of simply watching from the sidelines, she would delve into Patricia's past. She knew that many people had spoken highly of her, but few knew where she had come from, or how she had risen so quickly to power. Elizabeth dug into old records and news archives, tracing Patricia's history back as far as she could. Patricia's story, it seemed, was a familiar one, a woman who had grown up in humble beginnings, a devout Christian who had risen through the ranks of the church with determination and faith. But there was always something missing. No one seemed to know how she had become so influential so quickly. There were no significant milestones or markers along the way, just a sudden jump into prominence. The more Elizabeth researched, the more she began to sense something troubling beneath the surface. In the early years of Patricia's ministry, there were whispers about her sudden wealth, the strange people who had begun to visit her church, people with power, people with connections. But these whispers were quickly silenced. Patricia had cultivated an image of purity, of holiness, and any question about her rise to power was quickly brushed aside. But Elizabeth couldn't let it go. There had to be more. There always was. The more she uncovered, the more Elizabeth felt the weight of the deception pressing down on her. Patricia wasn't just a preacher, she was a master manipulator. And she wasn't using her gifts for good. She was using them to control, to profit, and to deceive. The final straw came when Elizabeth stumbled upon a piece of information buried deep in the church's financial records. There, in black and white, was a list of donors, prominent businessmen, politicians, and wealthy individuals. But it wasn't the names that caught her attention. It was the amounts. These donors had been giving exorbitant sums of money, large sums, to Mama Essie's ministry. But the money wasn't going to the church or to charitable causes. It was going to Patricia herself. Lavish vacations, luxury cars, expensive gifts. There was no transparency, no accountability. It all clicked in Elizabeth's mind. Patricia wasn't just a healer, she was running a cult, a massive operation designed to feed her growing wealth and power. And her followers, her devoted congregation, were nothing more than pawns in a game she had been playing for years. Elizabeth's pulse quickened as she sat back in her chair. She knew now that this wasn't just about exposing a fraudulent healer. This was bigger. This was about stopping a woman who had built an empire on the backs of vulnerable people, people who believed in her, who trusted her, who were willing to sacrifice everything to gain her favor. The darkness she had felt in her gut was real. And it was time to expose it. Chapter 3: The Sacrifice. The days blurred together for Elizabeth. What had started as a simple curiosity had now become an obsession. The more she uncovered about Patricia, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. The more she investigated, the more unsettling the truths became. There were whispers, rumors, and now cold, hard evidence that Patricia was not the holy woman she claimed to be. No, she was something else, something darker, more dangerous. But every step Elizabeth took brought her closer to the truth, and yet, it felt as though the walls were closing in around her. She couldn't stop now. There were lives at stake. Elizabeth sat at her desk late one evening, a stack of old newspapers and church financial reports spread out before her. Her laptop hummed quietly, the only sound in the dimly lit room. Her fingers moved rapidly over the keyboard, searching for anything that could tie Patricia to the underground occult rumors that had been circulating for years. She scrolled through news archives and interviews, hoping to find a clue that would break the case wide open. Then, as if by fate, she found it. A name. Pastor Benji. The name immediately caught her attention. She had heard Patricia mention him before, always with reverence in her voice. But what Elizabeth hadn't known was that Pastor Benji was more than just a mentor to Patricia. He was the one who had introduced her to a darker side of the ministry. The man who had convinced her to sacrifice everything she had ever held dear. Elizabeth quickly clicked on the link, her fingers trembling with anticipation. The article was old, dated back to when Patricia had first started her rise to fame. According to the report, Pastor Benji was known for his controversial teachings. He had preached about the need for greater sacrifices for those seeking real power in the ministry. And, more disturbingly, he had led a group of pastors who practiced a secretive, dark ritual known as the ceremony of the blood. Elizabeth felt a chill crawl down her spine as she read on. The ritual was said to involve the sacrifice of something deeply personal, something that would bind the practitioner to a higher power. For Patricia, the sacrifice had been the most unimaginable of all, her ability to have children. The truth hit her like a punch in the gut. Patricia hadn't just made a spiritual offering to gain power, she had traded something far more precious. She had given up her very future. Her humanity. Elizabeth sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, her mind spinning. She thought back to everything she had learned about Patricia, her immaculate appearances, the miraculous healings, the promises of divine blessings. It was all a front. Patricia wasn't just using her followers for money or influence, she was using them to feed an ancient, otherworldly power. Her eyes flicked over to the file she had compiled, filled with bank statements and donor records. The pieces were all coming together. But one question remained: why had Patricia been so desperate for power? Elizabeth leaned back, trying to organize her thoughts. Everything about Patricia screamed ambition, her rapid rise to fame, her perfectly curated image, and her followers' blind devotion to her. But this wasn't just about personal gain. Patricia had given up her ability to have children, a symbolic act of losing one's future, for something much darker. What could make someone sacrifice that much? Elizabeth's fingers hovered over the keyboard again, and then, a thought struck her. She turned to her notes on Patricia's recent behavior, the late-night disappearances, the strange rituals that had been hinted at by some of the more seasoned members of the congregation. It had all been there, hidden in plain sight. But Patricia's secret wasn't just about ambition. It was about control over life itself. Suddenly, everything clicked. Patricia's rituals, the mirrors, the so-called blessings, all of it was part of something larger, a plan to gain dominion over not just her followers, but over the very forces of life and death itself. Without wasting another second, Elizabeth grabbed her coat and rushed out of the apartment. She couldn't waste any more time. She had to speak to someone who might have answers. She drove quickly to the outskirts of town, to a small, inconspicuous library that she had been frequenting. It was the last place Patricia's influence would reach, and it contained old church records that might offer the final piece of the puzzle. Inside, The air was still and quiet, the only sounds the soft rustle of paper and the occasional footstep echoing down the narrow aisles. Elizabeth headed straight for the back, where the old archives were kept. She had been here before, but today, the weight of her investigation felt heavier than ever. The library's archivist, a woman named Mrs. Houghton, greeted her with a warm smile but immediately noticed the tension in Elizabeth's posture. "Another late night of research?" Mrs. Houghton asked, her voice low and knowing. Elizabeth nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. She needed answers. She needed to know how far Patricia's corruption ran, and what, if anything, she had left behind that could stop her. After a few minutes of searching, Elizabeth found what she was looking for, a stack of old church records from Patricia's early years. She pulled them down, flipping through the dusty pages. Most of it was mundane, detailing the church's activities and the community outreach programs. But then she came across a journal entry from a pastor who had left Patricia's ministry long before it had risen to prominence. It was dated 5 years before Patricia's church had become a household name. The entry was brief but chilling. "Patricia has changed. She no longer seeks God's favor, she seeks something else, something darker. She no longer speaks of faith, but of power. She says the only way to achieve greatness is through sacrifice. I don't know what she has done, but it's not of God." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she read the entry over and over. It confirmed everything she had suspected. Patricia wasn't just practicing dark rituals for the sake of power, she was on a quest for something greater, something that was beyond the realm of human understanding. The journal entry ended abruptly, and that was all. There was nothing more. No details, no explanation of what Patricia had done, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that Patricia's rise to power hadn't been a mere coincidence, it had been planned, orchestrated, and carefully hidden from the public. As Elizabeth left the library, her mind raced. She had learned more in the past 48 hours than she had in months of casual attendance at Mama Essie's church. The woman they worshipped was not a prophetess. She was something far more dangerous, a predator feeding off the weaknesses of her followers. And now, Elizabeth was the only one who knew the truth. But there was still one thing left to discover: how far Patricia's influence reached, and who else was involved in her occultic practices. As she drove home, the weight of the discovery settled heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She had to expose Patricia for what she truly was, and there was no turning back. Chapter 4: The Underwater Covenant. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she closed the journal she had found at the library. The words written by the former pastor haunted her mind, confirming all of her worst fears. Patricia had been playing a dangerous game for far too long. What Elizabeth had once thought were minor suspicions about Patricia's powers had now evolved into something far darker, something that could no longer be ignored. As the days passed, Elizabeth grew increasingly restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that Patricia's influence was far more pervasive and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The church, the community, the ministers that served under her, everything was part of a much larger scheme, a scheme that reached deeper into the fabric of society than anyone had realized. Elizabeth needed to know the truth. She needed to understand how Patricia had gained so much power, why she had chosen this dark path, and how far her influence really reached. But the more she uncovered, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to evade her grasp. It was late one evening when Elizabeth sat in her apartment, surrounded by stacks of documents, papers, and the journal she had uncovered. She had connected the dots between Patricia's rise to fame and her interactions with Pastor Benji, but the missing link, the true source of Patricia's powers, remained elusive. There were rumors, whispers about something more, something ancient. But every lead she followed only seemed to lead her further into a web of deception. In frustration, Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the quiet street below. The rain had started again, its rhythmic tapping on the window soothing yet unsettling. She needed a breakthrough. She needed to uncover the truth behind Patricia's powers. What was it that had allowed her to become so untouchable, so dangerous? Then, as if by some invisible force, a thought hit her like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't just Patricia's rise to power that needed explanation, it was the source of that power. Where had it come from? What had Patricia sacrificed to gain it? There were rumors of a mysterious ritual, a dark pact that had been made in exchange for influence and wealth. Elizabeth had heard the whispers before, but they had always seemed like mere gossip. What if they were true? Elizabeth couldn't wait any longer. She had to find out where this all started, what had truly happened to Patricia, and where her dark powers had come from. She had to know if it was a product of a manipulation, a curse, or something even more sinister. Her mind raced as she grabbed her coat and keys, determined to uncover the truth once and for all. There was one place left she hadn't checked, the old church basement. It was a place she had heard about from other longtime congregants, a place where some of the older, more secretive members of the church would meet after hours. They whispered about rituals, dark ceremonies, and whispered promises of power. Elizabeth had never been down there. The basement was a forbidden place, locked and kept off limits for anyone not in Patricia's inner circle. But now, it seemed like the only place where she might find the answers she sought. As she drove to the church that night, the wind howling outside her car, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been creeping over her. The church was quiet when she arrived, the parking lot empty except for her car. The lights were dim, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally as she approached the building. The air was thick with tension, as if something unseen was watching her. When Elizabeth reached the door to the basement, she paused, hesitating for just a moment. The lock on the door was old and rusty, but it seemed like a minor obstacle for someone with the determination she had. She had spent the last few weeks uncovering piece by piece of Patricia's empire, and now, the final truth lay just beyond that door. With a soft click, the lock turned in her hand, and the door creaked open. The air was damp and musty, the smell of mold mixing with the faint scent of incense. The basement was cold, the only light coming from the dim glow of a flickering bulb in the corner. As Elizabeth stepped inside, the darkness seemed to swallow her whole. The basement was cluttered with old church furnishings, stacks of unused chairs, and forgotten equipment. But it was the back corner that caught her eye. There, hidden away beneath layers of dust, was a large, ornate mirror. The frame was carved with intricate symbols, swirling patterns that seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as she approached the mirror. It was the same mirror that Patricia had been using to manipulate her followers, the so-called mirror of life. She had never seen it this close, but now, standing before it, Elizabeth could feel an almost palpable energy emanating from it. The mirror was more than just a tool, it was a conduit. A portal. With trembling hands, Elizabeth reached out and touched the surface of the glass. The coldness of it shot through her fingers, but as she made contact, a sudden vision flooded her mind. She saw Patricia, standing at the edge of a dark river, her body twisted and distorted, shedding her human form. She watched in horror as Patricia transformed into something else, something serpentine, with glowing eyes that pierced through the dark. Then, as if she was being drawn by an invisible force, Patricia submerged into the river, vanishing beneath the waves. The vision ended as quickly as it had come, and Elizabeth staggered back from the mirror, her heart pounding. She could feel her pulse racing, the air thick with fear. The truth was out. Patricia's power didn't come from God. It came from the depths of the ocean, from a dark, ancient force. The underwater kingdom, the marine kingdom, had given her the power to control and manipulate her followers. And now, Elizabeth understood. Patricia had made a pact with the marine queen. She had sacrificed everything, her humanity, her future, her soul, to gain the power to control the lives of her followers. It was no longer about faith. It was about domination. Elizabeth felt a cold chill crawl down her spine as the enormity of the situation dawned on her. Patricia wasn't just a false prophetess. She was a puppet of an ancient, malevolent force, a force that had been manipulating her, controlling her every move. And Patricia was no longer in control. The Marine Queen was. Elizabeth's heart hammered in her chest as she slowly backed away from the mirror. She had uncovered the truth, but what now? How could she fight something so ancient, so powerful? And what would happen to her if Patricia found out what she knew? She had no answers. But she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't stop now. She had to expose Patricia for what she truly was, no matter the cost. Chapter 5: The False Miracles. The revelation in the basement had left Elizabeth shaken to her core. Patricia wasn't just deceiving her followers, she was part of something far older, far darker than she could have ever imagined. The Marine Kingdom wasn't a metaphor or a figure of speech, it was real, and Patricia's power was a result of an ancient pact that bound her to an underwater kingdom of darkness. The weight of the discovery pressed down on Elizabeth, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. She had uncovered the truth, and the only thing left was to expose it. But how? How could she reveal the extent of Patricia's deception when so many of the church's followers believed in her? How could she make them see the truth? Elizabeth had always prided herself on her intellect, her ability to connect dots and piece together the puzzle. But this was different. Patricia wasn't just some fraudulent preacher out for money and power, she was manipulating the very fabric of reality, using powers that Elizabeth could never hope to understand. She had to act quickly. Over the next few days, Elizabeth kept a low profile, staying away from the church as much as possible. She knew that if Patricia suspected anything, it would be over before it even started. Elizabeth was no longer sure who she could trust. Everyone in the church seemed either blinded by faith or under Patricia's spell. She had seen the way they worshipped her, the way they followed her every command, no questions asked. It was as if Patricia's every word was gospel, and no one dared question the truth of her miracles. Elizabeth couldn't let that continue. One Sunday, when the church was at its most packed, Elizabeth decided to take action. She had learned to be strategic, to think ahead, and today, her plan was simple: gather more evidence. She couldn't just walk in and confront Patricia. She needed undeniable proof, something that would leave no room for doubt. She arrived early, slipping quietly into the back of the church and taking her seat among the congregation. The air was thick with expectation, as it always was when Patricia was about to take the stage. There was a palpable sense of devotion in the room, a reverence that made Elizabeth uneasy. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the idea that Patricia had manipulated so many innocent people, or the thought that she might be too powerful to stop. As the service began, Elizabeth kept her eyes on Patricia, watching her every move. She couldn't help but notice how flawless Patricia looked, how effortlessly she commanded the room. Every word that escaped Patricia's lips was laced with authority, with the kind of confidence that only someone with real power could exude. "Mama Essie is here to heal," Patricia's voice rang out, smooth and rich, like honey, wrapping around her congregation. "You are blessed. You are chosen." The congregation erupted into applause, and Elizabeth felt a knot twist in her stomach. The people here believed in Patricia. They trusted her. To them, she was a miracle worker, a savior. But to Elizabeth, Patricia was a fraud, a woman who had sold her soul to the depths of the ocean, a woman who preyed on the desperate for her own gain. Patricia began her healing service, moving down the aisles, stopping to touch the sick, the desperate, the broken. Elizabeth watched as Patricia laid her hands on a woman's forehead, whispering softly, her voice barely audible over the hushed murmurs of the crowd. The woman's eyes fluttered closed, and within moments, she was jumping up, shouting with joy. "I'm healed. I'm healed," she cried, her arms raised in praise. The congregation cheered, clapping and shouting, giving glory to God. But Elizabeth wasn't fooled. She had seen this before. She had seen these miracles with her own eyes, and she knew that they were nothing more than a well-executed performance. The next healing was no different. A man in a wheelchair, crippled for years, was brought forward. Elizabeth had seen this man in the market just a few days earlier, walking with a cane. She had even spoken to him. Now, he was supposedly healed, leaping to his feet with a joyful shout, arms raised in praise. The crowd went wild, and the atmosphere became electric. But this time, Elizabeth didn't just watch from a distance. She leaned forward, watching every detail. She could see it in the man's eyes. He was pretending. He was acting. And she knew that this wasn't a divine miracle, this was a calculated performance designed to manipulate the crowd. Patricia stood beside him, raising her arms triumphantly. "Praise the Lord for his mighty power," she declared, her voice booming. "God has touched this man's body and healed him from the inside out." The congregation erupted again, but Elizabeth was no longer listening to the cheers. She was watching the man's eyes, his nervous glances toward the back of the room, his stiff posture, as if he was waiting for someone to give him a cue. Elizabeth's stomach churned. This was a lie, a performance designed to keep the congregation under Patricia's control. The more Elizabeth watched, the more she realized the scope of Patricia's deception. It wasn't just about money or influence, it was about power. Patricia had created an empire built on lies, manipulating the emotions of vulnerable people, convincing them that she held the key to their salvation. And they believed it. Every word, every gesture, every miracle was part of her plan to tighten her grip on their lives. As the service continued, Elizabeth slipped out of the church, her mind racing. She had to expose Patricia for what she truly was. But how? She had seen the way the congregation responded to her, the way they defended her. Any attempt to challenge Patricia's authority would be met with hostility, even violence. The people here weren't just followers, they were devotees. Elizabeth knew that in order to stop Patricia, she would need more than just suspicion and doubt. She needed hard evidence. And she had to act quickly. The longer Patricia's web of deception went unchecked, the more people would fall under her spell. That night, Elizabeth stayed up late, poring over the records she had collected. She was determined to find something, anything, that could expose Patricia's lies once and for all. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized the extent of Patricia's control. This wasn't just a religious scam, this was something far more insidious. Patricia wasn't just deceiving her followers, she was manipulating the very fabric of their lives. Elizabeth's heart raced as she came across a new piece of evidence. It was a video recording, dated just weeks ago, of a healing service in another city. The footage was shaky, but the image was clear. Patricia was performing a miracle on a woman in a wheelchair. The woman stood up, just like the man earlier. But there was something different about this footage. The woman's reaction didn't seem natural. It was scripted. It was staged. Elizabeth sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. This was the proof she needed. Patricia was no prophetess. She was a master manipulator, using deception to control and destroy lives. With this video, Elizabeth knew she had the ammunition to expose Patricia for what she truly was. But the question remained, how could she make the world see the truth? Chapter 6: The Mirror of Life. Elizabeth's mind raced as she walked home that evening, replaying the events of the day. The video, the staged miracle, the false healings, it was all becoming too much to bear. She had always been a woman of reason, of fact. But the more she uncovered about Patricia, the less logic seemed to apply. The woman wasn't just a fraud, she was wielding power that defied all understanding. Patricia wasn't merely deceiving people for wealth or fame, she was manipulating their very souls. And the tools she used to control them were more insidious than Elizabeth could have ever imagined. That night, Elizabeth sat at her desk, her laptop open in front of her. She had spent hours reviewing the video she had found earlier, watching it frame by frame. The woman in the wheelchair, the one who had walked after Patricia's supposed healing, wasn't just an actor. Elizabeth had recognized her. She had seen her at church several times, always sitting in the back, always quiet, always looking like she was waiting for something. But now, with this new evidence, it was clear she had been paid to participate in Patricia's performance. But that wasn't the worst of it. The deeper Elizabeth dug, the more she uncovered about Patricia's control over her followers. She wasn't just using them to build her wealth and influence. No, she was using them as pawns in a much darker game. The mirror of life, as Patricia called it, was one of the tools that Patricia used to manipulate her followers. Elizabeth had heard whispers about the mirror before, but it wasn't until she saw it firsthand that she realized just how powerful it truly was. The mirror wasn't just a symbol. It was a device, a tool that allowed Patricia to peer into the very souls of her congregation, to see their deepest fears, their most intimate secrets. And worse, it allowed Patricia to control what they saw, what they believed, and how they acted. Elizabeth had been present in one of Patricia's services when she introduced the mirror to the congregation. The way Patricia had spoken about it, her voice smooth, commanding, almost hypnotic, made it clear that this was no ordinary piece of glass. She had called it a divine instrument, a way for the faithful to connect with God and see the parts of their spirit that needed healing. But what Patricia didn't tell them was that the mirror was tied to the very dark forces she had aligned herself with. The more Elizabeth thought about it, the more she realized that the mirror was a conduit for the marine kingdom. It allowed Patricia to manipulate not just the minds of her followers, but their very spirits. She wasn't healing them. She was controlling them, locking them into a cycle of dependency and blind faith. The mirror gave Patricia the ability to plant suggestions, create visions, and feed on the energy of her followers' emotions. And that was only the beginning. Elizabeth knew she had to get a closer look at this mirror. She couldn't expose Patricia without it. But how? The mirror was kept hidden from most of the congregation, locked away in a private room in the church, accessible only to Patricia and her closest aides. That's when an idea began to form in her mind. If she couldn't get to the mirror directly, she could go after those who used it. If she could get one of Patricia's followers to talk, to reveal what the mirror really did, she would have the evidence she needed to bring Patricia down. Elizabeth spent the next few days talking to members of the congregation, subtly asking questions, probing for information. At first, no one seemed willing to talk. Patricia's influence was so deep that it had become a near-sacred taboo to question her methods. But Elizabeth was persistent. She had been raised in a family that valued the truth above all else, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her from uncovering it now. Then, one evening, as she was leaving church, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Kyra, a young woman who had recently joined the congregation. Elizabeth had seen her at several services, sitting quietly in the back, always watching but never participating. Kyra was different from the others, her eyes were filled with doubt, her body language closed off. Elizabeth approached her cautiously, trying to gauge her mood. "Kyra, right?" she asked, offering a warm smile. "I've seen you at a few services. How do you like the church?" Kyra glanced up, startled at first, then offered a hesitant smile. It's fine, I guess." Elizabeth could tell there was more beneath the surface. She had seen the way Kyra watched Patricia during the services, the way her eyes seemed to flicker with uncertainty. "You seem like you have some questions," Elizabeth said gently. "I know it can be overwhelming sometimes." Kyra shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting toward the front of the church, where Patricia was still mingling with her followers. "I don't know," she muttered. "It's just, sometimes, I don't feel like I belong here. Like I'm being pulled into something I don't understand." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. This was her chance. "What do you mean?" What don't you understand? Kyra looked around again, her voice dropping to a whisper. The mirror. Mama Essie, she says it helps us see our spirits. But I don't know, something doesn't feel right about it. Sometimes, I see things in it, things that don't make sense. I don't know if I'm seeing what I'm supposed to see, or if it's something else. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. This was it. She had to push further. What kind of things do you see? Kyra hesitated, her eyes clouding over with fear. I see people I know, acting strange, doing things they wouldn't normally do. But then, when I try to talk to them, they act like nothing happened. Like they don't remember. Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice low. It's the mirror, isn't it? It's showing you things that aren't real. Kyra nodded, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know what to believe anymore. Mama Essie says the mirror is blessed, but it's like it's showing me something else. Something dark. Elizabeth's mind raced. This was confirmation. The mirror wasn't just a tool for spiritual growth, it was a device for manipulation. Patricia was using it to control her followers, to make them believe things that weren't true. And now, Elizabeth had the evidence she needed to expose it. But there was one problem: Kyra was terrified. She knew the truth, but she was too afraid to speak out. Elizabeth looked at her, her voice firm. You don't have to be afraid, Kyra. You can help stop this. We can expose the truth. We can free everyone from Patricia's control. Kyra's eyes welled with tears. But what if she finds out? What if she uses the mirror on me? Elizabeth put a hand on her shoulder, offering a reassuring smile. We'll make sure she can't hurt you. We'll make sure the truth comes out. As they stood there in the quiet of the church, Elizabeth knew this was just the beginning. The mirror was the key to everything. And with Kyra's help, she would finally bring Patricia's lies to light. Chapter 7: The Rising Doubts. The air in Elizabeth's apartment was thick with tension. The quiet hum of her computer was the only sound breaking the silence, as she scrolled through the files on Patricia's ministry. The more she uncovered, the more horrifying the truth became. Every new piece of evidence only seemed to deepen the mystery, each layer of deception Patricia had woven more intricate than the last. But Elizabeth couldn't back down now. There was no turning back. She had made a promise to herself and to the countless people whose lives had been ruined by Patricia's false miracles and manipulations. She had to expose the truth. Kyra had been a key turning point. The young woman's confession about the mirror, how it didn't just show her reflection but manipulated her perceptions, even making her see false visions, had confirmed everything Elizabeth had suspected. The mirror was the tool Patricia used to control her followers, to twist their reality and bend their will to hers. It was more than just a divine tool, it was a dark conduit that connected Patricia to the marine kingdom, a source of power far beyond what any human should be able to control. Kyra was terrified, and Elizabeth could understand why. After all, Patricia wasn't just a false prophetess, she was a master manipulator with the ability to control minds, emotions, and perceptions. If Patricia found out that Kyra had spoken to Elizabeth, there would be no telling what might happen. Elizabeth's mind raced as she pieced together what she had learned so far. The ritualistic sacrifices Patricia had made, the manipulation of her congregation, the false healings, it was all part of something much larger, something far darker. Patricia had tied herself to an ancient and malevolent force, using the mirror and her powers to keep her followers in line, to build her empire, and to further cement her hold over them. But the more Elizabeth thought about it, the more she realized the scope of Patricia's deception. The influence she wielded wasn't just confined to her church. It stretched far beyond, into politics, business, and law. Elizabeth had already seen evidence of high-profile donors who had been feeding money into Patricia's ministry, but there was something far more sinister at play. Patricia had built an entire network, a web of influence, that was so entrenched, so deeply woven into the fabric of society, that it seemed impossible to break. And yet, Elizabeth was determined to try. She had been working around the clock, gathering evidence, speaking to anyone who might have information. Her nights had become endless hours of research and surveillance, trying to find any way to expose Patricia's lies. The truth was out there, and Elizabeth knew that with every passing day, the stakes were growing higher. Patricia was too powerful, too influential, and too dangerous to be allowed to continue her reign of manipulation. It was during one of these late nights of research that Elizabeth found something that made her blood run cold. She had been reviewing the church's financial records again, this time focusing on the donations from wealthy patrons. There were the usual high rollers, business owners, politicians, influential figures, but one name stood out. It was an anonymous donation, made through a shell company, a sum of money so large that it dwarfed all the others. The donation was made to a separate account that wasn't tied to the church's regular funds. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she followed the trail. The money had been funneled into a secret account, one that led to a high-end development project, one that Patricia had been overseeing. She had thought it was just a luxury mansion, another display of her wealth. But as Elizabeth dug deeper, she uncovered something far more troubling. The mansion wasn't just a home, it was a compound. Elizabeth knew she had to see it for herself. The next morning, Elizabeth gathered her things and set out for the mansion. The place was located on the outskirts of town, far from the church and the community Patricia had built. It was isolated, hidden from prying eyes, surrounded by high walls and security cameras. It looked like the kind of place where secrets were kept, where things too dark to be seen in the light of day were hidden away. She parked her car a distance away, slipping into the woods that bordered the estate. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She moved quietly, staying in the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. The mansion loomed ahead of her, a sprawling structure with ornate architecture that looked out of place in the middle of the forest. It was too perfect, too pristine. Everything about it screamed excess and control. Elizabeth crept closer, her eyes scanning the property for any signs of activity. She saw nothing at first, just the silent, imposing building. But then she spotted movement near the back, a group of people walking toward a hidden door in the side of the mansion. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by hoods, moving with an eerie purpose. Her instincts kicked in. This was it. This was where the truth lay. Elizabeth moved quickly, her heart racing as she made her way around the back of the mansion, staying hidden from view. She found a small opening in the wall, a crack just large enough for her to slip through. On the other side, the area was dimly lit, the stone floor cold beneath her feet. The walls were lined with strange symbols, etched in a language she didn't recognize. It felt like the kind of place where dark rituals took place, where people were made to believe in things that weren't real. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached the center of the room. There, on a pedestal, stood the mirror. The mirror of life. It looked exactly like the one she had seen at the church, only larger, more imposing. The symbols etched into the glass seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, pulsating with a dark energy that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. This was the heart of it all. The source of Patricia's power. Suddenly, Elizabeth heard voices approaching. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to get out of there, now. But as she turned to leave, she heard footsteps behind her. They were closing in fast. Before she could react, a hand gripped her arm, pulling her into the shadows. Elizabeth gasped, her body stiff with fear, but then she heard a familiar voice whisper, "You shouldn't be here." It was Kyra. Chapter 8. The First Revelation. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as Kyra's hand gripped her arm, pulling her into the shadows of the mansion's hidden corridor. The sudden movement startled Elizabeth, and she instinctively tried to pull away, but Kara's grip was firm, her expression one of urgency. "You shouldn't be here," Kara whispered, her voice trembling. "Patricia, she knows what you're doing. She knows you've been asking questions." Elizabeth's mind raced. How could Kara know? She had been so careful, so deliberate. But as the reality of the situation hit her, she realized Kara had been following her movements too, keeping track of her every step. Patricia had eyes everywhere. "I need to understand what's going on, Kara," Elizabeth said, her voice low and steady. "I can't just walk away from this. I can't ignore the truth anymore. Patricia is using all of you, manipulating your lives. She's not the woman you think she is." Kara's eyes flickered with fear. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've seen it. I've felt it. But I don't know what to do. I'm so scared, Elizabeth. You don't understand, Patricia, she's not just a prophetess. She's something else." Elizabeth's throat tightened. She had feared it for weeks now, but hearing it from someone else, someone who had witnessed it firsthand, confirmed the horrifying truth. Patricia wasn't just deceiving people for wealth or power. She was using an ancient, dark power that no one understood. "She's using the mirror," Kara continued, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "The mirror isn't just for showing us our souls. It's how she controls us. She can see everything, our fears, our desires. She uses it to manipulate us into doing whatever she wants. It's like she's feeding off our emotions." Elizabeth's mind reeled as she processed Kyra's words. The mirror was more than just a tool for control, it was a vessel, a conduit that connected Patricia to something darker, something far beyond human understanding. The marine kingdom wasn't just an allegory. It was a living, breathing force, one that Patricia had bound herself to in order to gain her power. "And you're right," Kara whispered, taking a shaky breath. "Patricia knows what you're doing. She's watching. She's always watching. That's why I came to warn you." Elizabeth's thoughts were racing. She couldn't stay here. Not without risking everything. "We need to leave," she said urgently, pulling at Kyra's arm. "Now." But Kyra hesitated, her gaze shifting toward the mirror. "We can't. You don't understand, Elizabeth. If you expose her, if you try to reveal what's really happening, she'll destroy you. She's already got her grip on everything, the church, the city, the people. She controls them with that mirror, and if you get too close, she'll make sure you never leave." Elizabeth took a step back, feeling the weight of Kyra's words. The reality of what she was facing began to settle in. Patricia wasn't just an isolated threat, she had built a web of power that extended through the entire community, through the very fabric of society. No one was safe. And anyone who crossed her would be swallowed whole. But that only made Elizabeth more determined. She couldn't let Patricia continue to manipulate people. Not when she had the power to stop it. "I don't care what it costs," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with conviction. "I'm going to expose her, Kyra. I can't let this go on any longer. She's ruined so many lives, and I won't stand by and watch her destroy more. We can stop her. We have to." Kyra's face twisted in agony. "You don't understand. She's not just some woman who's using a mirror. She's made a pact with something far older, far darker than any of us can comprehend. She's part of the marine kingdom. And if you try to stop her, you'll be dragged into it. I don't want to see that happen to you. I've seen it happen to others who tried to fight her, people who were close to her, people who believed they could defeat her." Elizabeth's gaze hardened. She had already come this far. She had already risked everything to uncover the truth. She wasn't going to stop now. "I'm not afraid of her," Elizabeth said, her voice low but steady. "And I'm not going to let her control me or anyone else. I'll do whatever it takes to bring her down. We can't let her keep destroying people's lives. Kyra's eyes filled with fear, but there was something else there too, something like resolve, as if, despite her fear, she was starting to believe in Elizabeth's determination. Okay, Kyra whispered, her voice barely audible. But you have to promise me something, Elizabeth. Promise me that you'll be careful. If she finds out you're onto her, she'll do whatever it takes to destroy you. She's done it before. She's done it to people who were stronger than you. Elizabeth nodded, her mind already racing with the next steps. She had to gather more evidence, she had to expose Patricia's lies, her manipulation, her ties to the Marine Kingdom. But she couldn't do it alone. I will be careful, Elizabeth promised, though she knew in her heart that the stakes were too high for her to back down. But we have to move quickly. If we wait too long, she'll be too strong to stop. Kyra seemed to hesitate for a moment, then nodded. I'll help you. I've seen enough. I know what she's doing to us. But we have to act fast. And we need to make sure we have enough proof. If we don't, no one will believe us. Together, they turned toward the mansion's exit, their steps cautious and measured. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavy in the air, but Elizabeth was no longer afraid. The truth had to come out. No matter what it cost her, no matter what she had to sacrifice. As they crept through the corridors of the mansion, Elizabeth's heart raced, knowing that the final confrontation was drawing closer. But one thing was certain, she wouldn't stop until Patricia's reign of manipulation was over. Chapter 9 Behind the Scenes. The rain had returned with a vengeance, drumming steadily against the windows of Elizabeth's apartment as she sat at her desk, going over her notes. Kyra had left hours ago, but Elizabeth was still wide awake, piecing together the puzzle that was Patricia's empire of deception. Elizabeth couldn't believe how quickly her life had spiraled into chaos. What had started as a search for answers about a woman with extraordinary influence had turned into something far more dangerous. Now, Patricia wasn't just a manipulative preacher, she was the head of a dark and ancient network, with power that reached far beyond what Elizabeth had imagined. The mirror. The Marine Kingdom. The sacrifices. It was all connected. But the more Elizabeth dug, the more questions arose. What exactly did Patricia gain from her connection to the Marine Kingdom? Why was she willing to sacrifice so much, even her humanity, for the sake of power? And more importantly, how could Elizabeth expose this truth when the very system that should protect people, the government, law enforcement, and media, was all under Patricia's control? She glanced down at her phone, the screen lit up with new messages. It was Kyra. We need to meet. I've learned something new. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to ask what Kyra had learned, it was always something disturbing, something that added another layer to the nightmare Patricia had created. I'm on my way, Elizabeth replied, her fingers shaking slightly as she sent the message. Kyra had been the one person who had truly seen through Patricia's facade. But she was terrified. Elizabeth could sense it. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Patricia wasn't just a figurehead. She was the mastermind of a dark operation, and no one was safe from her wrath. Elizabeth's mind was still spinning as she drove to the cafe where they had agreed to meet. She had to act quickly. Time was running out. Every day that passed, more people fell under Patricia's spell, blind to the truth that was right in front of them. But how could she expose a woman who seemed to have control over everything? How could she make the world see what was really going on when the truth itself seemed like the stuff of nightmares? The cafe was quiet when Elizabeth arrived. The kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Kyra was already there, sitting in the far corner, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Elizabeth slid into the seat across from her, trying to steady her breath. What's going on, Kyra? Elizabeth asked softly. What have you found? Kyra looked around again before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. It's worse than I thought. I was digging into some old church records, things I wasn't supposed to see, and I found something disturbing. Elizabeth leaned in, her pulse quickening. What did you find? Kyra took a deep breath. Patricia, she's been getting help from people outside the church. Powerful people. People we've heard of, businessmen, politicians, even law enforcement officials. They've been funding her ministry, and it's not for the reasons we think. They are not just giving her money, they are involved in the rituals too. They are getting something in return. Elizabeth felt her stomach drop. What do you mean, involved in the rituals? Kyra's eyes locked with Elizabeth's, her expression grim. I've seen them. The rituals Patricia performs in private. I've seen the men who come to her for guidance. I've heard them talk about it, how they receive power in exchange for their loyalty to her. These aren't just wealthy donors, some of them are part of the Marine Kingdom too. Elizabeth's mind reeled at the implications of Kyra's words. So it's not just a church. It's a network. A secret society that's been operating right under our noses. Kyra nodded, her voice trembling. Yes. And what's worse is that they're using Patricia to manipulate not just the congregation, but the entire city. People in power are backing her because they believe in what she can offer them. They think that by supporting her, they'll gain favor with the Marine Kingdom. They'll get wealth, influence, and protection. Elizabeth shook her head, trying to make sense of what Kyra was saying. But why? Why is Patricia doing this? What does she really want? What's her endgame? Kyra's gaze fell to the table, her hands shaking. I don't know, but I have an idea. I've seen things. There's something deeper, something darker, at play here. Patricia is not just a servant of the Marine Kingdom, she's a queen in it. She's more than just a vessel for their power. She's a leader. And the more she takes from her followers, the more she grows in power. Eventually, she'll have enough strength to manipulate the entire world. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. A queen in the Marine Kingdom. It all made sense now. The reason for the sacrifices, the reason for her manipulation, it wasn't about money or fame. It was about something much more dangerous, a bid for ultimate power. Elizabeth sat back, absorbing the enormity of what Kyra had revealed. Patricia wasn't just a woman playing at being a prophetess. She was playing a game that reached far beyond the church walls. She was connected to an ancient, malevolent force, and she was using it to build a kingdom of her own. Elizabeth's mind whirled with the possibilities. If Patricia was truly a queen in the Marine Kingdom, there were no limits to what she could do. And if Patricia's followers were just pawns in her game, then the entire city, the entire country, could be at risk. I need to get more information, Elizabeth said, her voice hard with determination. We need to expose her, Kyra. The truth needs to come out. Kyra looked up at her, her eyes filled with fear and doubt. But how? How do we expose someone who's untouchable? Who's backed by so many powerful people? People who have everything to lose if this comes out. Elizabeth's eyes burned with resolve. We gather the evidence. We expose it piece by piece. And we find allies who will believe us. People who have the courage to stand up to her. Kyra hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'll help you. I'll do whatever it takes to stop her. But you need to be careful, Elizabeth. This goes beyond just exposing Patricia. She's connected to something far darker than we can imagine. We can't fight her alone. Elizabeth's gaze hardened. We are not alone. And we are not backing down. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 10, The False Prophetess. The truth about Patricia's power was beginning to unravel before Elizabeth's eyes, piece by piece, but with every new revelation, the danger seemed to grow. Elizabeth had known from the beginning that Patricia wasn't the woman she pretended to be, but the extent of the deception, the manipulation, and the sinister forces that controlled her ministry were more than Elizabeth could have ever anticipated. And now, with Kyra by her side, Elizabeth was more determined than ever to expose the lies. The problem was, Patricia wasn't just a self-proclaimed prophetess. She wasn't simply using the trust of her followers to line her pockets and build her empire. No, Patricia was operating on an entirely different level, a level that was as dangerous as it was hidden. Her influence extended far beyond the church's walls and into the very systems of power that governed the city. With connections in the political world, the business world, and even law enforcement, Patricia had built a network of influence that protected her, ensuring that she was untouchable. But that didn't stop Elizabeth from trying. "I've been going through everything I can find," Elizabeth said, sitting at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. "We've got records of donations, connections to powerful businessmen, and even law enforcement officials. Patricia's reach is deeper than we thought." Kyra sat across from her, her face pale and drawn. She had been helping Elizabeth gather information, but the closer they got to the truth, the more the weight of their task seemed to bear down on her. "How do we expose this? Everyone loves her. The people in the church, the politicians, even the police, no one is going to believe us." Elizabeth rubbed her temples. She knew Kyra was right. People were loyal to Patricia. They believed she had a direct connection to God, that she was performing miracles for them. But those miracles were lies, orchestrated carefully to manipulate them. They were being controlled by the very woman they thought was their savior. "We start small," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the fear building inside her. "We expose the things we can prove. We show the world that Patricia's healings are fake. We expose the actors she uses, the people she's deceiving, the money she's funneling into her own pockets." Kyra nodded, but her eyes were filled with doubt. "And then what? How do we expose the Marine Kingdom? How do we tell people that Patricia is connected to something that's far darker than anyone can imagine? No one will believe us." Elizabeth knew that exposing Patricia's ties to the Marine Kingdom was going to be the hardest part. No one would believe that a woman like Patricia, a woman with such a public image of purity and righteousness, could be involved in something so sinister. But Elizabeth also knew that they had no other choice. "If we can't show them the truth about the Marine Kingdom, we'll show them the truth about Patricia's manipulation," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "Once we break her image, once we show people how she's been lying to them, the rest will follow. We'll have to take it step by step, but we can't stop now." They spent the next few hours going through more files, more documents, more evidence that would back up their claims. The further they dug, the more they discovered that Patricia's operation was far more extensive than they had imagined. She wasn't just deceiving her congregation for money, she was using her followers to build an army of influence, one that could control the fate of the city itself. Elizabeth stared at one particular document. It was a list of names, powerful names, business leaders, politicians, and law enforcement officers who had donated large sums of money to Patricia's ministry. But these weren't just donations. They were investments. Investments in Patricia's future, in the success of her manipulations, in her rise to power. Elizabeth had to act quickly. She couldn't let this continue, couldn't let Patricia keep deceiving everyone. But there was no way she could take down Patricia alone. "We need help," Elizabeth said, her voice suddenly soft. "We can't do this by ourselves." Kyra looked at her with a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. "But who can we trust?" Elizabeth thought for a moment. She knew it was dangerous to involve anyone else, especially with Patricia's web of influence spreading so far. But there was one person who might be able to help. Someone who had been a part of the church for years, someone who had seen through the lies long before Elizabeth had. "I know someone," Elizabeth said. "Someone who's been watching Patricia for a long time." We can trust them. Kyra looked skeptical but nodded. I just hope we're not walking into a trap. Elizabeth stood up, determination setting in her shoulders. If it's a trap, we'll be ready. They set out the next morning, meeting in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Elizabeth's contact was a former member of the church who had been disillusioned by Patricia's rise to power. His name was David, and he had left the ministry after discovering that Patricia was more than just a preacher. She was a manipulator, using her position to control everyone around her. David was waiting for them when they arrived, sitting at a table in the back, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He was a tall man, older than Elizabeth, with a rugged face that seemed worn by years of hard work. He looked up as they approached, his expression wary but not unfriendly. "You're sure about this?" David asked, his voice low and gravelly. Elizabeth nodded. "We don't have a choice. Patricia has to be stopped." David studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You know what you're up against, right? This isn't just about exposing her lies. It's about exposing a system that's been built over decades. People will come after you." "I'm ready," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "We have to expose her, or she'll keep destroying people's lives." David nodded, his face grim. "Then we'll do this together." Over the next few days, Elizabeth, Kyra, and David worked tirelessly, gathering as much evidence as they could. They collected testimonies from former followers, photographs from Patricia's secret meetings, and documents that proved the connections between Patricia and the powerful figures who had been helping her. But the more they gathered, the more dangerous their situation became. They were getting closer, too close to the truth, and Patricia was starting to notice. One evening, as Elizabeth was leaving her apartment, she saw a familiar figure in the distance, a man in a dark suit, standing by her car. His expression was hard, cold, and as he turned toward her, she realized who it was. It was one of Patricia's men, a bodyguard who had been at every event, watching, listening. Elizabeth's heart raced as she realized the danger she was in.